Someone get this librarian her books. This is a firing range, not a study hall. The words, sharp and dripping with condescension, cut through the dry desert air. The crowd of cadets, all sharp creases and youthful arrogance, rippled with sycophantic laughter. They stood in a semicircle on the hallowed grounds of the Ethelgard Military Academy's Advanced Ballistics Range, a place carved from rock and reverence, where legends were forged in fire and precision. The object of their ridicule, a woman named Alara Vance, offered no reaction. Her face, a study in placid neutrality, did not twitch. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant target array, shimmering like a mirage 1,000 meters away. She was of indeterminate age, dressed in simple, functional civilian attire that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, making her appear smaller, less substantial than the uniformed figure surrounding her. Her silence was a vacuum, and the lead cadet, Sergeant Kalen Thorne, rushed to fill it with more of his own noise. He was the Academy's golden boy, a legacy admission with a jawline as sharp as his uniform's press and an ego that cast a shadow longer than the afternoon sun. To him, this woman was an anomaly, a bureaucratic error. She had been introduced as a civilian observer for their final qualification, a guest of the Academy's command. He saw only a soft, academic presence, an intrusion into his world of steel and smoke. He saw her unassuming posture not as controlled stillness, but as timid hesitation. He saw her plain, unadorned hands not as instruments of lethal calm, but as the soft, untested appendages of a clerk. He couldn't reconcile her presence with the sacred space of the range, a place he considered his personal kingdom. But when the Academy Commandant, General Armitage, saw her stance from his perch in the observation tower, he saw something else entirely. He didn't see a librarian. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible blade of the body, the perfect weight distribution of a human platform built for one purpose: absolute stability. He saw a foundation rooted to the earth, a posture he hadn't seen in 20 years, not since a whispered about operation on the razor-edged ridges of the Alcadir Mountains. The general leaned forward, his binoculars finding the woman's profile, a flicker of disbelief crossing his weathered features. Down on the range, the humiliation continued, a slow, corrosive drip of institutional arrogance. Thorne, emboldened by his audience, took a step closer to her, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. "With all due respect, ma'am," he began, the word ma'am a deliberate, sarcastic barb. "This equipment is highly specialized. It requires a certain familiarity. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the library archives? I hear they've just declassified some fascinating reports on Napoleonic supply chain logistics." The cadets snickered again, a loyal chorus to their leader's cruel song. Alara Vance remained a statue of calm. Her only movement was to place her rifle case on the prep table. It was a battered, anonymous black polymer case, its surface a roadmap of scuffs and scratches, each one a silent testament to a journey unknown. It was this case, this plain and battered object, that seemed to offend Thorne the most. It lacked the gleaming, custom-fitted perfection of his own gear. It was humble. It was quiet. It was, in his eyes, unworthy. If you believe respect is earned in silence, not shouted from a pedestal, type earned below. The air on the range was thick with unspoken rules and brutal hierarchies. Ethelgard was more than a school. It was an ecosystem where the strong, or at least the loudest, preyed on the quiet. Kalen Thorne had mastered this ecosystem. He moved through it with the predatory grace of a creature born to its apex. He saw Alara Vance as an invasive species, a disruption to the natural order he had worked so hard to dominate. His campaign against her was not just about ego. It was about preserving a worldview that placed him at the center. "Standard procedure, ma'am," Thorne said, his voice taking on a tone of mock officialdom as he gestured towards a rifle case. "All civilian equipment brought onto a live-fire range must be inspected for safety and compliance. We wouldn't want any unapproved modifications causing a mishap." It was a lie, a transparent abuse of his minor authority as the ranking cadet on the line. No such rule existed for guests of the commandant. It was a power play designed to publicly unmask her as the fraud he perceived her to be. He expected to open the case and find a standard issue, poorly maintained rifle, or worse, some expensive but impractical civilian weapon that would confirm his diagnosis of her as a hobbyist, a dilettante playing soldier. His two closest acolytes, Cadets Jennings and Rourke, moved to flank the table, their expressions a mixture of smug superiority and pack animal loyalty. They were Thorne's shadows, reflecting his arrogance back at him in a self-sustaining loop of validation. The other cadets held back, a gallery of silent witnesses. Some looked uncomfortable, a flicker of doubt in their eyes, but none dared to challenge Thorne. His influence was too absolute. His retribution for dissent was swift and surgically precise, delivered not with fists, but with social isolation and whispered accusations in the ears of instructors. To stand against Thorne was to commit social and professional suicide at the academy. And so they watched. Alara Vance gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She did not protest. She did not argue. She simply stepped back from the table, ceding the space. Her hands rested at her sides, perfectly still. This passivity, this utter lack of resistance, was gasoline on the fire of Thorne's contempt. It proved to him that she was weak, that she had no right to be here, that she was intimidated. He didn't understand that her stillness was not passivity, but patience. It was the calm of a mountain waiting for a storm to break against it, knowing the wind would pass and the rock would remain. Thorne unlatched the case with a theatrical flourish. The clasps popped open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in worn, custom-cut foam, was a rifle. But it was not what he expected. It was an M210, a familiar platform, but this one was different. It was stripped of all non-essential components. The stock was worn smooth in the exact contours of a shoulder and a cheek. The metal of the receiver was faded to a soft gray, not from neglect, but from the constant friction of hands and holsters and the unforgiving embrace of the elements. It was a tool, not a trophy. It was an instrument that had been used, and used hard. A faint, almost invisible etching was present just above the trigger assembly, a small, stylized ghost. Thorne didn't recognize it. To him, it was just another strange modification. But in the tower, General Armitage zoomed his binoculars in on that mark, and his blood ran cold. He recognized the symbol of the Ghost Legion, a unit so deep in the Black Ops world that the official government position was that it did not, and had never, existed. Thorne's disappointment was palpable. The rifle was strange, but not damning. He needed more. His eyes scanned the contents of her duffel bag, which she had placed beside the case. "Standard inspection continues," he announced, his voice tight with frustration. He reached for her bag. This was the true violation. A rifle case was one thing. A personal bag was another. This was a direct, calculated act of humiliation. He was no longer hiding behind procedure. He was simply asserting his dominance, searching for anything, a book on tactical theory, a half-eaten protein bar, anything to prove she was just an ordinary woman in a world of extraordinary men. He unzipped the main compartment, his hands rummaging inside, a sneer fixed on his face, certain of the mundane treasures he would find. The cadets leaned in, the drama reaching its crescendo, ready for the final, satisfying confirmation of their shared prejudice. The simulation began without warning. A klaxon, shrill and demanding, echoed across the valley, a sound that instantly vaporized all the petty drama on the firing line. On the massive screen above the range, red lights flashed beside the words, "Dynamic Systems Failure." Manual Override Protocol, Omega. The cadets froze. Omega Protocol was a myth, a legend whispered about in the barracks. It was a theoretical training scenario, a doomsday contingency programmed into the Academy's most advanced systems, but never, ever activated. It was designed to simulate a total electronic warfare environment, where every smart scope, every laser rangefinder, every wind sensor was rendered useless. The automated target arrays, which normally moved with predictable precision, would now be controlled by a chaotic, randomized algorithm designed to mimic the unpredictable movements of a panicked, asymmetric enemy force in a complex urban environment. To pass, a shooter would need to make a series of 5 shots on 5 different targets, at ranges varying from 800 to 1,500 meters, with targets appearing for no more than 3 seconds each, all while compensating for shifting wind variables calculated only by instinct and observation. No cadet in the history of Ethelgard had ever successfully completed a single shot of the Omega Protocol, let alone all 5. It was considered unwinnable, a test of humility designed by a sadist. Kalen Thorne stared at the screen, his face pale. His arrogance, so buoyant just moments before, had vanished, replaced by a cold knot of dread. All his expensive gear, his state-of-the-art ballistic computer, his digital anemometer, all of it was now just dead weight. This test wasn't about technology. It was about something older, something more primal. It was about the raw, unvarnished connection between a shooter's eye, mind, and trigger finger. It was about instinct. General Armitage's voice boomed over the range's comm system, calm and authoritative. Cadets, as you can see, we are experiencing a simulated catastrophic system failure. Protocol Omega is active. This will be your final qualification. A wave of murmurs and curses swept through the cadets. This was a death sentence for their scores, a guaranteed failure. Armitage let the reality sink in for a moment before continuing. We have a guest with us today. Ms. Vance. Regulations for civilian observers require them to demonstrate baseline weapons proficiency in the event of an emergency. Please proceed to the firing line and complete the qualification. The order was a thunderclap. Thorne and his cronies turned to look at Alara, their faces a perfect picture of astonishment. This was impossible. They were setting this librarian, this clerk, up for a public execution. The general had to be joking, but the general did not joke. Alara Vance showed no surprise. She simply walked back to her table, her movements unhurried and deliberate. She did not rush. She did not panic. She moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. Her hands, which Thorne had dismissed as soft and untested, became instruments of breathtaking efficiency. She lifted the M210 from its case, the worn metal settling into her grasp as if it were a part of her own arm. She slid a magazine into the well, the click of the mechanism seating itself echoing with a clean, metallic finality. She did not mount a scope. Instead, from a small pouch on her belt, she produced a set of simple iron sights, mounting them to the rifle with a series of precise, practiced twists. The cadet stared dumbfounded. Iron sights, at this range, in these conditions. It wasn't just impossible, it was insane. It was a gesture of such profound, almost suicidal confidence that it bordered on madness. Thorne watched, a cold, sick feeling rising in his chest. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, sharp and unwelcome, pierced his armor of certainty. He was watching a ritual, and he was beginning to understand, with dawning horror, that he was not the high priest. Alara Vance settled into her shooting position. It was not the rigid, by-the-book posture the Ethelgard instructors drilled into their cadets. She flowed into the earth, her body becoming an extension of the ground itself, a stable, organic platform of bone and muscle. She rested the rifle not on a sterile bipod, but on her battered duffel bag, a simple, practical choice that spoke of countless hours spent in less-than-ideal conditions. The first target indicator lit up on the board. A small, humanoid silhouette at 950 meters, partially obscured by a simulated piece of cover. A digital timer appeared beside it. 300 seconds. The wind, a capricious desert ghost, gusted from left to right, kicking up dust devils far downrange. A normal shooter would need a dozen calculations to even attempt this shot. They would need to factor in windage, elevation, spin drift, temperature, humidity, and the Coriolis effect. Alara did none of this. She simply closed one eye. Her breathing, which had been slow and steady, seemed to stop altogether. She existed in a pocket of absolute stillness, a void of pure focus in the heart of a chaotic world. The cadets held their breath, a collective, silent prayer of anticipation and dread. Thorn watched, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. The world seemed to slow down. For 2 long seconds, nothing happened. The timer ticked down, 215. 158, 089. Just as the target was about to vanish, a single, clean crack echoed from a rifle. It was not the thunderous roar of the cadets' high-caliber weapons. It was a sharper, more refined sound. A punctuation mark. A full second later, a soft ping traveled back across the range, the unmistakable sound of a copper-jacketed round striking hardened steel. On the main screen, the first target's silhouette turned from red to green. A perfect center mass hit. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It had to be luck. A 1 in a million fluke. The second target appeared. 1,200 meters. This one was a moving target, sliding from behind a wall for just 25 seconds. The wind shifted, now gusting towards her. Alara did not adjust the dial. She did not consult a chart. She simply shifted her point of aim a few imperceptible millimeters to the left, exhaled half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. Crack. A second later, ping. The second silhouette turned green. The murmuring among the cadets died completely. They were no longer watching a potential failure. They were witnessing a miracle. The third target, 1,450 meters, the furthest limit of the range, visible only as a tiny speck. A hostage target, where a hit on the red no-shoot zone just inches from the green target would mean instant failure. The wind was now a swirling vortex, unpredictable and treacherous. Alara took the full 3 seconds. Her eye traced the invisible path of the wind, reading the dance of the heat haze, the sway of a distant desert shrub. She was not calculating physics. She was communing with it. Crack. A long pause, the bullet traveling for nearly 2 seconds across the vast expanse. Then the impossibly small, impossibly distant sound. Ping. Green. The fourth and fifth targets appeared almost simultaneously, a complex split target engagement requiring the shooter to acquire and fire on 2 separate hostiles in under 4 seconds. It was the final cruel joke of the Omega Protocol. Crack. She worked the bolt of her rifle with a fluid, practiced motion, the empty casing ejecting in a perfect, gleaming arc crack. Ping. Ping. 5 shots. 5 targets. 5 green lights on the board. A perfect score. In the aftermath, there was only silence. A profound, deafening silence that was heavier and more absolute than any sound. The wind seemed to die down, as if holding its breath in reverence. The only sound was the gentle tinkle of the 5th spent shell casing as it spun to a stop on the concrete beside her. Alara Vance calmly cleared her weapon, her movements still measured and economical. She stood up, brushing the dust from her pants, her expression as neutral and unreadable as it had been all day. She had not performed a feat of marksmanship. She had stated a fact. Kalen Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. The entire foundation of his world, his belief in his own superiority in the established order of things, had been shattered into a million pieces by 5 rounds of copper and lead. The woman he had dismissed, mocked, and humiliated was not just competent. She was a master. She was something beyond his comprehension. And in that moment, he felt a fear more profound than any he had ever known on a battlefield. The fear of his own complete and utter insignificance. General Armitage descended from the observation tower, his boots echoing on the metal staircase. He moved with a purpose that commanded attention, his presence silencing the shocked whispers that were just beginning to ripple through the stunned cadets. He didn't stride onto the range with anger or triumph. He walked with a heavy, deliberate gait, the walk of a man about to perform a solemn duty. He ignored the cadets completely. His eyes were fixed on Alara Vance, and in them was a look of profound, almost pained respect. He stopped a few feet from her, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken history. The general then turned his gaze to Kalen Thorne. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. It was a cold, hard thing, stripped of all warmth. "Cadet Thorn," he said, his words precise and clipped. "You were conducting a safety inspection. You were so certain of your assumptions. Please, complete it." Thorn flinched as if struck. He looked from the general to Vance, his face a mess of confusion, fear, and dawning shame. He didn't understand. The general gestured to the open duffel bag, the one Thorn had been so eager to rummage through just minutes before. "You were looking for something to confirm your judgment of this woman. I suggest you look again." More carefully this time, with trembling hands, Thorn knelt beside the bag. The other cadets crowded closer, drawn in by a gravity they could not resist. Thorn's hands, which had been so arrogant in their violation, were now hesitant, almost fearful. He pushed aside a neatly folded jacket and a small data slate. Underneath was a rectangular case, wrapped in dark blue velvet and tied with a simple cord. It was unassuming, easily mistaken for a toiletries kit or a book. Thorn looked up at the general, a question in his eyes. The general simply nodded. "Open it." Thorn's fingers fumbled with the cord. He unwrapped the velvet, revealing a polished wooden box with no markings. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn, dark satin, were 3 medals. But they were not the common campaign ribbons or marksmanship awards that adorned the cadets' own dress uniforms. These were different. They seemed to absorb the harsh desert light, radiating a quiet, dangerous energy. The first was the Star of Valor, a shard of obsidian set in a platinum starburst. It was the highest award for covert gallantry, given for acts of extreme bravery performed in operations the government would never acknowledge. Fewer than a dozen had ever been awarded. The second was the Sentinel's Cross, a simple, unadorned silver cross engraved with a single, sleepless eye. It was given to intelligence operatives who had survived, alone and unsupported, for more than a year behind enemy lines, their very existence a closely guarded secret. It was a medal for ghosts, for people who had sacrificed their names for the sake of the mission. And the third made Thorn's breath catch in his throat. It was a single, blackened rifle casing, hung from a strip of crimson silk. It was the Ghost Legion's highest commendation, the last round citation. It was awarded only to a soldier who had been the last surviving member of their unit, who had held the line against impossible odds, and who had, with their final bullet, turned the tide of a battle. It was not a medal. It was a memorial. It was a myth, a story told to frighten recruits. It wasn't supposed to be real. A wave of understanding, cold and sharp, washed over the assembled cadets. They were not looking at a collection of awards. They were looking at a life lived in the shadows, a life of sacrifice and silent, brutal competence that they could not begin to imagine. Thorn stared at the medals, his mind struggling to process the information. The librarian, the clerk, the soft, unassuming woman he had mocked. It was all a lie, a catastrophic misreading of reality. General Armitage let the silence hang for a moment longer, allowing the weight of the discovery to settle into the very bones of every person on the range. Then he spoke, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried the weight of history. "For those of you whose education has been incomplete," he began, his eyes sweeping over the cadets and lingering on Thorn, "allow me to clarify. You are not in the presence of MS. Vance, you are in the presence of Command Sergeant Major Ilara Vance, retired. And her unapproved rifle has a name. The armory logs call it Widowmaker. It is the rifle that held the northern pass, alone, for 17 hours during the siege of Tartarus Station. The last round fired from that rifle, the one that broke the final enemy assault, is the one you see in that box." The general paused, letting the name of the battle, another classified and mythic engagement, sink in. Command Sergeant Major Vance was the lead instructor for the Tier 1 Special Operations Marksmanship Program for 10 years. She wrote the doctrine on extreme-range engagement that you cadets study and consistently fail to master. She designed the Omega Protocol herself, as a graduation exercise for operators who were already considered the best shooters on the planet. The reason she is here today is because I asked her, as a personal favor, to evaluate the pathetic state of this academy's marksmanship standards. A standard, Cadet Thorn, that you so arrogantly claim to represent. Every word was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling Thorn's world. The general then did something that no one on that range had ever seen. He turned to face Command Sergeant Major Vance. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand to his brow in a slow, perfect, formal salute. It was not the casual gesture of a superior to a subordinate. It was a salute of profound, unequivocal respect. A four-star general saluting a retired, non-commissioned officer. It was a reversal of the entire military hierarchy, a public declaration that true rank was not determined by the insignia on one's collar, but by the weight of one's deeds. Alara Vance, in response, simply gave a short, sharp nod of acknowledgement. It was all that was needed. In that moment, the power dynamic on the range was irrevocably rewritten. The loud, arrogant cadet was reduced to a humbled, kneeling boy. The quiet, unassuming woman was revealed as the giant she had always been. Respect had been recalibrated. Order, the true order based on competence and not on assumption, had been restored. The story of what happened on Range 7 did not just spread through Ethelgard Academy. It detonated. It moved through the barracks and mess halls not as gossip, but as a legend being born in real time. It was a wildfire of revelation, burning away the old, comfortable hierarchies and leaving behind a landscape of stark, undeniable truth. Cadets who had been there recounted the tale in hushed, reverent tones. They spoke of the deafening silence after the fifth shot. They described the look on Thorn's face when he saw the medals, a look of a man watching his own ghost walk towards him. They tried, and failed, to capture the sheer, world-altering gravity of the general's salute. The event was given a name. The librarian's lesson, the firing point from which she had made the impossible shots, was unofficially christened the Vance Line. Cadets would walk by it, touching the concrete as if it were a holy relic, a tangible link to a moment of pure, unadulterated competence. The legend took on its own life, growing with each retelling. Some said she hadn't used sights at all, that she'd shot from the hip. Others swore the wind had stopped completely on her command. These embellishments were unnecessary. The truth was already mythic enough, but they spoke to a deep, collective need within the academy to make sense of what they had witnessed. They had seen a living legend, a ghost from the secret wars walk into the light, and they needed a mythology to contain her. For Kalen Thorn, the aftermath was a quiet, personal hell. He was not formally punished. General Armitage knew that public disgrace would be a clumsy, ineffective tool. The true punishment was internal. Thorn had built his identity on a pillar of perceived superiority, and Vance had demolished that pillar with 5 precisely placed rounds. He lost everything that mattered to him: his credibility, his swagger, the respect of his peers. The cadets no longer looked at him with admiration. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was the man who had tried to bully a god. Thorn disappeared from the social center of the academy. He stopped holding court in the mess hall. He resigned his position as cadet platoon sergeant. He was adrift. A few days after the incident, several cadets saw him approach Command Sergeant Major Vance as she was leaving the range. They expected a confrontation, or perhaps a formal, stilted apology. Instead, Thorn said nothing. He simply took a cleaning kit from his pocket, knelt, and began to meticulously clean her rifle. Widowmaker, he disassembled it with the care of a surgeon, cleaning every component, his movements slow and deliberate. It was an act of silent penance, an admission of his own ignorance, and a gesture of profound respect. Vance watched him for a moment, then sat down on a crate beside him. She didn't speak of the incident on the range. Instead, she began to talk to him in a low, calm voice, not about shooting, but about breathing. She spoke of stillness. She explained that the arrogance he projected was a form of noise, a desperate attempt to fill a void of inner silence. True confidence, she explained, was not loud. It was quiet. It was the absolute, unshakable knowledge of one's own capabilities, a knowledge that required no external validation. It was the first lesson in his real education. The librarian's lesson became more than just a story. It became a cultural touchstone at Ethelgard. The ripple effects of that single afternoon reshaped the Academy's very ethos. Command Sergeant Major Vance, at the General's insistence, stayed on as a permanent consultant. She never wore a uniform, never claimed a formal title. She remained the quiet observer, but her presence was a constant, powerful reminder of the new standard. The arrogant, chest-thumping culture that Thorne had championed began to wither. Cadets started to value quiet competence over loud proclamations. They began to understand that the most dangerous person in the room was often the one who spoke the least. Vance became a mentor to the unlikeliest of students. She sought out the cadets on the margins, the ones who were too quiet, too thoughtful, too analytical to thrive in the old system. She found a young woman with an eidetic memory who struggled with the physical demands of training and taught her how to turn her mind into a ballistic computer. She found a scrawny boy from a poor background who was mocked for his worn-out gear and showed him that the quality of the soldier was more important than the quality of his equipment. She didn't run drills or give lectures. She taught by example. Her philosophy was simple. The target doesn't care about your potential. It doesn't care about your family name or your physical strength. It only responds to one thing: the precise application of a fundamental skill. Master the silence in yourself, and the rifle will follow. A symbolic artifact of the event was created, solidifying its place in Academy lore. The 5 spent shell casings from her perfect run of the Omega Protocol were collected. They were mounted on a simple mahogany plaque and hung in the main hall of the Marksmanship Center. Beneath them, a brass plate was engraved with a single quote attributed to her: "Assumptions are the heaviest burden a soldier can carry. They will get you killed faster than any bullet." The plaque became a mandatory stop on every tour for new recruits. The story was told to every incoming class, a cautionary tale and an inspirational benchmark. Kalen Thorne's transformation was perhaps the most profound legacy of the event. He completed his training, but he was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful humility. He graduated not at the top of his class, but somewhere in the middle, his focus having shifted from winning awards to achieving genuine mastery. He requested a posting not to a prestigious combat unit, but to a training command, where he could pass on the hard-won lessons he had learned. He became one of Ethelgard's most effective instructors, known for his patience, his meticulous attention to detail, and his fierce opposition to any form of bullying or ego. He was especially hard on the cadets who reminded him of his younger self, seeing it as his duty to save them from the same mistakes. He taught them that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the calmest heart in the storm. A few years passed. The world turned, and the nature of conflict shifted with it. Ethelgard Academy continued to produce officers, but they were a different breed from the ones who had come before. They were quieter, more analytical, and possessed a deep, instinctual respect for earned expertise over inherited status. The story of Command Sergeant Major Alara Vance and the librarian's lesson had become foundational, as much a part of the curriculum as drill and ceremony or tactical theory. New cadets arrived already knowing the legend, their eyes scanning the faces of the unassuming civilian staff, wondering if another legend walked among them. The Vance line was now an official landmark. The concrete had been painted, and a small, permanent shelter had been built over the firing point. It was used for the final, most difficult qualification shot for the Academy's sniper school, a single-round test, now known simply as the librarian's question to pass. A cadet had to answer it with a perfect shot, a demonstration that they understood the principles of stillness and humility that Vance had embodied. On a crisp autumn afternoon, a new class of recruits was gathered at the range for their orientation. Their instructor, a young but highly respected captain, led them to the plaque with the 5 shell casings. The captain was Kalen Thorne. His face was leaner now, and his eyes held a wisdom that went far beyond his years. He stood before the plaque and told the story, not as a piece of Academy history, but as a personal confession. He spoke of his own arrogance, his own ignorance, and the profound, life-altering humiliation he had suffered at the hands of a quiet professional. "Look around you," Thorne told the silent, wide-eyed recruits. "In every room you enter for the rest of your careers, there will be a command sergeant Major Vance. They will not announce themselves. They will not wear their accomplishments on their sleeves. They will be the quiet ones, the observers, the people you are most likely to overlook. Your ability to recognize them, to learn from them, and to give them the respect they have earned will determine whether you become a great leader or a cautionary tale. Your ego is a weapon pointed at your own head. The moment you think you are the most important person in the room is the moment you become the most dangerous," he pointed to the plaque. These 5 casings are a reminder that competence is quiet. It doesn't need to boast. It doesn't need a posture. It simply is. Your job is not to be the loudest. Your job is to be the calmest, to be the rock that the storm breaks against. That is the Ethelgard standard now. That is the Vance standard. He had learned the lesson, and now he was living it, ensuring that its legacy would endure long after he was gone. The true legacy of that day was not a plaque on a wall or a story told to recruits. It was in the thousands of small, almost invisible moments that followed. It was in the way a young lieutenant would now instinctively listen to the advice of a veteran sergeant, regardless of their own rank. It was in the way an analyst's quiet observation in a briefing room was given the same weight as a commander's loud assertion. The culture of quiet professionalism, seeded by Vance's 5 shots, had taken root and grown strong, spreading far beyond the walls of Ethelgard. Command Sergeant Major Vance never took credit for any of it. She eventually moved on from the academy, disappearing back into the quiet, unassuming life from which she had emerged. Some said she was advising on a new generation of covert technology. Others said she had simply retired to a small house in the mountains to read books. No one knew for sure. Her absence was as quiet and impactful as her presence had been. She left behind not a void, but a foundation. She had taught an entire generation of future leaders that the loudest voice does not equal the truest word, that arrogance is a brittle shield, and that true strength is found in the silent, disciplined mastery of one's craft. The story became a parable for a timeless truth, that in any organization, in any field, in any walk of life, there are giants who walk softly. They are the ones who have done the work, who have faced the trials, and who have earned their wisdom in silence and solitude. They do not seek the spotlight, for they have no need of its warmth. Their confidence is internal, forged in the crucible of experience. To judge them by their quiet demeanor, by their simple clothes, or by their lack of self-promotion is to make a foolish and often dangerous mistake. It is the duty of the wise to look past the noise and see the substance, to listen to the silence and hear the truth. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in your own name. It's what continues forward in the actions of others. It is the lesson that is learned and then taught again, the standard that is set and then met by those who follow. Alara Vance's legacy was not in the medals she had won, but in the humility Kaelin Thorne had learned. It was in the quiet confidence of the cadets she had mentored. It was in the silent, shared understanding that the highest honor is not to be recognized, but to be worthy of recognition. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption and where silent action defines true worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.